So I recall that a UK one of the UK ministers, he said that an ambassador is an honest gentleman that's sent abroad to lie for his country. And so that's the reality of modern politics, international politics and international relations. It's not based on, these are not based on men and women of integrity or statements by men and women of integrity. They're lying. They're lying to protect and secure their own interests, whatever those may be. They might use nice sounding words and phrases, and they'll have all the pomp and parades and so forth, but at the root of it all, they're lying, and that is what we have to keep in mind. But we're living literally in an age of truth right now, where light is exposing the darkness. Light is causing those who've been liars and lying all along. Now the world is seeing them for who they are. Mm-hmm. And this is the spirit that's going forth across the lands of Africa and other parts of the world who've been under this unholy dominion for all this time. They're waking up. There have been awakenings before, but this time I think I think we might be at that stage where the brothers and sisters actually get up out the bed, because when you might set that alarm and you get mad when that alarm clock go off and you're in that deep sleep. You knock the clock off on the floor. You'll hit that snooze button several times before you'll get up, sit on the edge of the bed and scratch for half an hour. You don't really want to get up, but it seems to me like we're in a different time right now where Jacob is definitely ready to stretch up and stand up. And that's what time it is, and we hope so, because Yah forbid, as Yeshua said, except these days be shortened, there should no flesh be saved.
Yeah. Rise Israel. All right, so now let's talk about Dimona. Let's talk about the community out here. Let's go to the beginning with it. Well, let's go to the beginning with. I want to start with 1968, when y'all first arrived here in Dimona. But I want to ask this question. Why did the law of return change after 1969, when brothers and sisters, started arriving here claiming, taking hold to their heritage that's rightfully theirs?
Yeah. That is the $77 million question. It can only be speculation on our part until we are able to access the records fully of perhaps the debates and dialogues that went on at the government level. But we can only speculate that after our arrival here in '69, we arrived and were essentially welcomed under what was the law of return. It was very loosely written. They weren't expecting anyone to come and present themselves and say, we're back here to serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they look like us. That was just not part of their conceptualization of the returnees, the prophetic return of Israel. They thought that that didn't apply to the darker, races of people on the planet. And I use that term races. Scientifically, race doesn't exist. It's a social construct. It's not a racial it's not a scientific construct. But nevertheless, unfortunately, race, even though it may not be real, racism certainly is real, and it has affected the world and blinded people globally. And Israel is not immune to that, for sure. It's a sickness that has to be overcome. But on our arrival, they didn't know what else to do with us. And so we were initially welcomed. We got housing, we got access to school, we had access to health care, we had furnished apartments, much as anyone else who was making Aliyah at that particular time. And looked up, and in 1970, the law of return was changed, and changed retroactively. And the new definition was written in such a way that defined us on the outside of that idea of who was entitled to return under that right, under that law of return. So we can only speculate that indeed it was an effort to write out any further, any in fact, by going back retroactively, it's pretty clear that it wasn't just any further, but we're going to write you out too. You know, so we can only speculate on that. But I deeply do believe personally that was the factor. That was the factor in there.
Wow. So since you mentioned that you believe that was the factor, let me ask this, because this is a controversial question right here too. Why do you think the powers that be are trying to suppress the African presence that's out here in Israel? And not only Israel, but in Egypt and in other parts of what they call, quote unquote, the Middle East. You know, why are they trying to suppress the African presence that's out here and don't publicize it, don't put it out there? What's going on with that?
Well, I always challenge Israel and the Jewish family that they must come back in touch with their African roots. Their African roots are indisputable. Newsweek, 1988, Black Adam and Eve on the cover. But the subtitle was Scientists Explore a Controversial Theory about Man's Origins. It was talking about the out of Africa model. So genetically, scientifically, it is proven that all humanity evolved out of this region here, and evolved from a common black father and mother. We know that the original. I think back to what year was it? I think it was 2008. National Geographic had a February edition of National Geographic, and on the cover was the Black Pharaohs, and had this brother on the cover. And when I saw it, I said, "What? They're finally going to tell the truth and admit that the ancient Kemetan people, the ancient Egyptians, were black?" I was like, whoa. Picked up a copy, and then as soon as you get into the story, you say, oh, wait a minute. And then you go back to the front again. Oh yeah, February, Black History Month, right? And what they were doing, it's kind of unfathomable, unbelievable, that they're giving Africans credit for a full 70 years of ruling ancient Egypt. 70, not 700 years, not thousands of years that Egypt existed as an empire, but 70 years. And their line was that the Nubians, who were the civilization a little further south into what they like to call Black Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, that the Nubians came into Egypt, and because Egypt was in decline, that the Nubians had the upper hand and were able to conquer Egypt. And not only just conquer Egypt, but they conquered Egypt using Egyptian principles and teachings and what have you. So it was the ultimate of discrediting any African authorship of goodness and power and prestige. But again, the issue, the color line, has to be drawn in this area. Why? It has to be drawn with Egypt. Because when Joseph was sold into captivity by his brethren, and his brethren later came into Egypt during the famine, they didn't recognize their brother who had matriculated to a very, very high position in Egypt. And if they didn't recognize him, that tells you something very important. It tells you that in antiquity, ancient Israelites and ancient Egyptians looked the same, except for the outer trapping of their clothing and garments and trappings of that nature. And so we understand why they have to draw the line somewhere between what is now Sudan and the modern state of Egypt. Those two areas, it's somewhere between ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia. They have to draw the line in the color barrier. Because if they give up ancient Egypt, they will also have to give up ancient Israel. And sad as it may be, but because of that color barrier, because of that prejudice, because of racism, because of those types of sentiments that prevail in the world, Israel again is not immune to this. Israel is affected by this as much as any other nation. In India, they have problems with the untouchables there, the darker caste. But guess what? The untouchables have Hebraic links. That's a whole nother story. But nevertheless, this is the issue, and we understand it. But we also know that we have a job to do, and we can't flinch at those types of things. We were told by Moses, the children of Israel, Joshua was told the children of Israel going into that land, the promised land, go in and possess that land, the land that we were promised. And he said, fear not, be not discouraged. Well, why did he have to tell them that? He had to tell them that because on the way into getting even what Yah himself had promised to us, we were going to encounter some things that were frightening and or discouraging. But our instructions were don't be afraid and don't be discouraged. So in this time, we meet it head on. And we have we're not going to, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness in high places. And so this whole controversy remains at the core of this region. Like you said, Netflix, Cleopatra, they're taking insult now. But again, go back just a few, in the late 70s, was it early, maybe 80, when Anwar Sadat was assassinated? That man was an African. It was very clear he was a very dark-skinned African. And the further south you go in Egypt is where you will find the darker peoples. But you got to know your history. You got to know the influx of invaders that came from the northern Icelandic regions upon ancient Europe. The Angles, the Saxons, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Huns. All these were northern Icelandic barbarians who descended on the Roman Empire, actually. And that is what cast Europe into what became known as the Dark Ages. And so later you had, again, and during that same period of time, you have China building the Great Wall against invaders from the north, the Mongolians, the Mongols coming down out of the north. But if you look at the southern parts of China, look at the southern parts of India, look at the southern parts of Europe, they're darker skinned. When you look at the Crusades that were, again, a continual succession of military incursions into Northeast Africa and North Africa, when you look at the one that got the credit for Scipio Africanus, who defeated Hannibal. They used to say that Africa was named after him. No, he was named after conquering Hannibal. He got the appendage Scipio Africanus. So we know that continual military pressure pushed many of the darker skinned Africans in this region further and further to the south. You got to know the history, and then you'll understand. Like there's a book we have called The Arabs. I think it might even be behind me, The Arabs. And on page 339, the guy talks about, by the way, the original inhabitants of Arabia were not the more familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people. Wait a minute. You write a book on the Arab people, and you don't put that on page 1 or the first chapter? You wait till page 339 in the appendix, literally, to put that real important critical reference? Well, it's important and critical for us and it's important and critical for anyone who seeks to know the truth. So race becomes the great bugaboo that we have to conquer. Now we've already conquered it. We conquered it. We had to deal with this. We can't change this.
Yeah.
You know, and they're the ones who have a problem with it, and they're the ones who are going to have to conquer it and get over it. But again, like I said in the beginning, they're going to have to come back in contact with their African roots. Why? Because we are a spiritual people. We are the people who are more inclined to get things right, to get, you know, if you're trying to tune in to a certain frequency of a broadcast on an FM station, for example, and the call sign of that particular station is 97.9, and you got 97.8. You know, with your Mishnah and your Talmud, you got 97.8. You know, but you're still going to have a lot of static. You know, but we bring the true, authentic idea and sensibility of our innate spirituality. There's no question about it that African people are the most spiritual on the planet. Spiritual, not religious, but we've confused religiosity with spirituality. We're the most religious too, but we have to abandon the religiosity and embrace the spiritual. And this is not just semantics. This is not just some wordplay. You know, we have to become spiritual, which is a 24/7 proposition, not religious and talking about church and study hour and a singles ministry or something. You know, it's got to be deeper. It's got to be a 24/7 relationship we're talking about. And we, the African family, we, the African Hebrew family, can bring that critical last degree of proper interpretation, where we won't be walking around talking about putting the law literally in a box on our forehead and on our arms and tying it to us. No, that it becomes an innate consciousness that we walk around with, and that all of our efforts and energies and works are aligned with that idea. You know, that they miss it. They follow the letter of the law, but they miss the spirit of the law. And so there's so many things that we bring to the table that they're going to have to take heed to. Again, Hebrew is an African language, Afro-Semitic, Afro-Asiatic. We hold the key innately to correctly getting this right, to getting this interpretation right as to what it means to be a Judean, what it means to be an Israelite, what it means to be Hebrew.
Okay.
Which of course embraces all of the Muslim family as well. You talk about the Hebrew family.
Yeah.
You know. So.
Yeah. Nah, definitely. So I'm gonna ask you two more questions, then we're gonna move on to the next part. But this question is, you know, because in America, the Hebrew Israelites it's a big thing in America right now.
Yeah. Fastest growing religious movement there.
Yes, like wildfire. It's going crazy. So I want to ask you this: how can we, you know, us as being African Hebrew Israelites, because I believe that's what we all are, African Hebrew Israelites. How can we come together, you know, as the children of Israel? How can we come together and show this unified front so the world can see? How can we do this?
It's an excellent question. And I say this without any animosity or without any sense of boasting. It's just prophetic fact that the word of the Lord would go forth from Jerusalem, not Chicago, not Gary, Indiana, not Miami, not Houston, you know, but Jerusalem. And I know this kind of, you know, grates against some teachings, because now there's this movement in recent years that wants to shift the presence of Jerusalem somewhere else. You know, that it's in Peru, as some would teach, or it's in Central Africa. Well, you may find name similarities, and you do find name similarities in different places, but who named those places? People, because you find people who identify as being from Jerusalem, from Israel, from this land, because they named other places. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the original place. Nat Turner was on his way to Jerusalem, a town in Southampton County, Virginia. It scared the white slave owners so bad they changed the name of the town to Cortland to this day. So we can't. I mean, what isn't New York? Wasn't it named after York? You know, I mean, so that doesn't hold water as far as we're concerned. In 2,000-3,000 years, Jerusalem wasn't uprooted completely from the memory and the reality, the archaeological reality that Jerusalem is. And by the way, when we go to places, when we go to Jerusalem, we're not going for spiritual reasons. We're going for historical reasons. That's just brick and mortar. But there was to be a new Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, the temple, the idea of a temple, the third temple, well, we didn't come here to build some new monument. We came here to restore and be restored as a people. We're the temple. Where does worship take place? And so, yes, it is very controversial as we awaken and as different groups come, but we've got to be honest and truthful that we cannot come out of our slumber. We cannot come out of that captivity. We cannot come into our Hebraic identity and not admit and agree that we come with the grave cloths of the Christian ideas that we were immersed in. You know, we've got grave cloths that we had to shake off. Even the whole idea of Christ and Jesus, well, those are Greco-Roman concepts. Those are Greco-Roman names. You know, by no other name can you be saved. Well, what was the name? You know, Jesus Christ. No, that could not have been the name. We know that the J didn't exist during that era. It's impossible for that name to have been the name. Historians know that wasn't the brother's name. And then you deal with the whole issue of Messiah, Mashiach, and what it meant, and the fact that in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they uncovered, what caused the Roman Catholic Church to suppress their release of the transcripts of the translations for 30 plus years was because of the very fact that it was Mishikim and not Mashiach that they uncovered in one of those scrolls. In other words, it was a plurality of messiahs. But we find a plurality of messiahs and saviors in the book of Obadiah. It says, and saviors shall come up on Mount Zion. Saviors, plural. You know, but we have been given this Christian idea and interpretation of a Messiah. You know, one who's literally going to come on a cloud. And so what are our messianic expectations? Are they not rooted in that Greco-Roman Christian idea? We have to shake that. It can't just be that you identify as being an Israelite and then you wake up, because remember now, a lot of the brethren, they had a contempt and a hatred, literal hatred for Africa. Couldn't call them an African. They were mad. They were angry at their Hamitic brothers because they sold them into captivity. That was the line. And so they were angry with them, seemingly forgetting that, hey, why were we being sold? That was part of the chastisement that Yah was the author of. You can't get mad at the rod that was used along the way to dispense with his justice. You know, so we had to wake up and realize that many of our Hamitic brethren that were scattered throughout Africa, they're actually Shemitic, the Lemba, and the other, all the other dispersed Israelites and other northeast African peoples that were scattered throughout the continent of Africa. So it's difficult, but it requires some humility. It requires being able to stop and think for a minute, clear the slate, and consider, you know, well, isn't Jerusalem our spiritual center? And here we are. We've been here 54, 55 years now. Why did we woke up to our identity quite a while ago? Ben-Ami was clear about his identity growing up as a youngster. His parents taught him he was an Israelite, and he's not. His vision didn't occur in a vacuum. When he was at the water fountain and an elder came up to him and said, "Hey, you're an Israelite," ding, what his parents had taught him resonated in his mind, and he began to learn more about that identity. And so, and I think it's key, and it can all be summed up in a message that Ben-Ami taught. Wow, this class must have been taught in about 2005 or 7, I believe. And he entitled it From the Knowledge of Identity to the Knowledge of Redemption. And we knew about the Prophet Crowleys. We taught that, the Bishop C.H. Mason and those others of that religious heritage of ours. Well, what other vehicle could that truth have been carried through? You know, we had Bibles that the slave owners made, that they ripped 3/4 of the Bibles out. You know, 3/4 of the pages were ripped out because they referred to freedom.
Yeah.
You know, and deliverance and so forth. They didn't want us reading about that, but there was still something in our songs and in our teachings that we are that lost sheep of the house of the tribes of Israel. And so that is what sustained us. That is what we were built on, and we just continued to follow it. But that knowledge of identity is what moved us in '66 with Ben-Ami's vision. What moved us into Liberia in '67 into what we call the wilderness. In the wilderness, I saw the other day, a brother's got a 2-hour class about if there was no wilderness. Well, I hope to get to it. 2 hours is a long time to go into such a topic. But for us, Liberia was a wilderness. It was the opportunity to unlearn all of the negative things that we had acquired as slaves in the captivity. We couldn't come into the Holy Land as Negroes and niggas. We couldn't do that. We would get spewed out of this land. You know, and that's the nature of this land. There's an organic link between the people and this land. And so we had to prepare ourselves for that return. And so that 2.5 years of cleansing for us, now not everybody, I came 10 years later. Not everybody had to go through Liberia and live in tents and brave snakes and spiders and ants and malaria and all those things. I've had malaria twice because I was in Congo and Ghana when I contracted it. But nevertheless, I didn't have to go through that same experience, but I still had to go through a sort of a wilderness. Everybody's got to go through some type of wilderness, because for us it's not necessarily a place but an experience. And so on the way back, you know, arrival in this land, the next day after arrival in this land, it's like the next question was, okay, we're here, now what? That's when we shifted from knowledge of identity to knowledge of redemption, because that's when our focus shifted to the now what was get back to that purpose of being that light, to create the institutions, to create the doctrine, to create the ideas, to create the environment, to create the community, to create the love that was necessary to build what you've seen over this last several days. So that became the mission. And we still, the knowledge of the history, the knowledge of identity, we don't have all those pieces. That was scattered and shattered all over the world. You know, so, or shattered and scattered all over the world. But we know that we also bring the portion of the redemptive purpose of being an Israelite. And that is something that we are 55 years ahead.
Yeah,
and we willingly share that idea and those principles.